Hello, Leftofawesome. I'm Quantum Tuba, and this Friday marks the anniversary of Ronald Reagan's death. Ronald Reagan, one of the worst and most overrated presidents in U.S. history.
I am Emperor Ronald Reagan, born again with fascist cravings. Still, you may be president.
If we judged Ronald Reagan merely by his words, you might expect me to like him. Ronald Reagan talked a lot about limited government, about the dangers of big government, about oppression and all that sort of stuff. So, why don't I like him? Why do I think he's one of the most overrated presidents ever? Because for all that talk, he expanded the government and was a horrible president for anyone who cared about liberty. For instance, there was an article to which I have a link in the sidebar that was originally published by a guy with the Ludwig von Mises Institute, who now works for the Foundation for Economic Education. It explains how Reagan didn't even really try to shrink the size of government in terms of its economic policies. How government spending expanded by about 60% during his presidency, and how he was the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover, including his imposition of so-called voluntary import restrictions on the automotive industry, which effectively amounted to a hidden auto bailout via protectionism. But despite being in actual practice and fact an opponent of free markets, Ronald Reagan still managed to damage equality, help crony capitalism, and damage the environment and science in the name of free market ideology. For instance, by the end of the Reagan and first Bush administrations, the average CEO salary was more than 100 times that of a typical worker, as compared to the 50 times that of the average worker prior to the Reagan administration. So, not so good for equality or workers' rights. Interestingly, I believe he also busted a union of government workers while president, so that's kind of asshattish, one might say. And then in terms of the environment, he did the same sort of thing that Bush did. He stacked the Environmental Protection Agency with plenty of industry cronies who would ignore important environmental data in favor of their own pro-business dogmas. So that's great, isn't it? But that's really the area where he's not the most hypocritical. Economics, he at least appeared to have some facade of freedom. Let's look at some other examples of his oppressive approach, shall we? How about the war on drugs? Oh my goodness. Ronald Reagan did not start the war on drugs, but he massively expanded it. And any of you who have watched my previous videos know that I consider the war on drugs to be one of the greatest oppressive apparatuses ever. Let's look at some of the things he did to make it more oppressive. First, he eroded the Posse Comitatus Act, which was an 1868 law that forbade federal troops from doing domestic law enforcement work. The erosion of Posse Comitatus under Reagan was what partially led to the use of military equipment in the debacle with the Branch Davidians in Waco in 1993, which interestingly was under the pretext that they were cooking meth, so it was specifically due to the war on drugs. Then, of course, he managed to massively oversimplify the debate with the help of his wife, Nancy Reagan, who started the whole "just say no" thing. Well, you can't exactly easily do that if you're already an addict, can you? And that's where the key problems are. So that pretty much lowered the intelligence of drug war discussion and managed to make our country even dumber and more sloganeering. When he passed the 1986 crime bill, that was where mandatory minimum sentences were imposed. And this created also federal sentencing guidelines, which removed parole in the federal system to ensure that prisoners would serve at least 85% of their sentences. Also, it included asset forfeiture laws. Let's go over the anti-liberal aspects of all these things. So, in the case of mandatory minimum sentences, this basically creates a calculation based on the amount of drugs you're connected to selling or some other such thing that means that circumstances can't be taken into account. You will get this sentence no matter what. So there was an example of, under mandatory minimum sentencing laws, a woman was sentenced to, I think, upwards of 80 years in prison for being on the phone at certain points and having conversations with her brother, who happened to be a drug dealer, because in those conversations she occasionally mentioned some things that ended up involved in his crack cocaine dealing. And so she was guilty, technically, of conspiracy. So, by the calculations, even though everyone on the judge and jury knew that she didn't deserve that, she had to get that thing. Then there's also the parole regulations, which of course make it so that we can't get around the mandatory minimum bullshit. And then finally, there's the asset forfeiture laws, which are total nonsense. What this does is, even though it has a good intention, the intention is to take the property that was gained through money you earned through drugs. Okay, seems reasonable. We don't want the drug dealers to be able to really profit. Unfortunately, the police have abused this, and they will often seize the property before charging a person, and sometimes without pressing charges. It's basically a complete revocation of property rights and gives the police state the capacity to steal indiscriminately. Yep. The government to give you everything you need. Is the government big enough to take everything you have? Ooh, who said that? Ronald Reagan. Oh, he should know. He helped create the government big enough to take everything you have. Then he passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, which established a federal death penalty for drug kingpins. Now, I happen to oppose the death penalty for reasons that are better explained by Jeremy Irons and Amnesty International, but establishing a death penalty for something that technically should be a free market activity, unless you illegalized it, that's just fucking stupid. Okay, there we have it. That's him on drugs and how he massively increased the police state and massively damaged our liberty.